Hello, everyone, and welcome back to day 4, the final day of the Recovery Summit. My name is Alex Patterson. I am broadcasting to you from Ottawa, Canada. I'm the Executive Director of Canada 2020 and one of the co-founders of the Recovery Project. I want to thank you all very much for tuning in. If you've watched part or all of our Recovery Summit, thank you very much. There have been thousands of you actually over the past 4 days that have tuned in. So we're really, it's been a real pleasure to put this program together for you. Today, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be sort of tying a bow on a lot of the conversations that we've had over the past 4 days. We're going to do that in 2 parts. First, we're going to be joined by an esteemed panel of policy thinkers and policy minds. And then we're going to be jumping to a conversation around public polling. So our opening panel is going to be with Kevin Page, the president and CEO of the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa. Alan Yu, who's a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. Heather Boushey, who's the president, CEO, and founder of the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. And Matt Brown, one of my fellow co-founder for the Recovery Project, co-founder of Global Progress and senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. After that, we're going to be joined by Frank Graves, who's the president and CEO of ECOS Research Associates, and Marcus Roberts, who's director for international projects at YouGov. But before we dive into the conversation, we thought that we might actually play a wrap-up and a summary video, sort of a highlight video of some of our favorite moments from the past 4 days, or 3 days. So let's run to that, and then we'll get into our discussion.
We have a tradition at the sort of Global Progress Canada 2020 gatherings of always beginning our discussions founded in some facts, in some opinions that have been sought from across the globe.
A few weeks ago, a young Republican woman from Wyoming who articulated this, I think, better than anybody else that I've seen in the group, when she said, in her words, almost every single system we have in America is broken. Healthcare, education, justice. I have no faith in our election process. It feels like I'm in the beginning chapters of a dystopian novel.
A pandemic, unlike the coronavirus, unlike an economic crisis or even a national disaster crisis, is an issue in which the decisions of individuals affect everybody else.
The more that politics intrudes on their everyday life, the more negatively predisposed they become toward politics and politicians. And we need to be very, very careful about that.
COVID-19 is the most severe public health crisis in a century, with more than 27 million reported cases and 880,000 deaths. Lives and livelihoods have been lost. The social, economic, and political impacts of the pandemic will be far-reaching and long-lasting.
But from a global perspective, it's time to look up. It's time to challenge one another to raise our eyes, to look farther to the future, and to look farther around us than those who are immediately affected and who immediately come to mind. This is a humanitarian crisis, and this is a time to look at the broad impacts of COVID-19.
But one thing we should keep in mind, front of mind, is this is like a forest fire. If the virus is anywhere, it's everywhere. And so it's in our own selfish self-interest, not only to vaccinate as many Canadians as we can, but also to vaccinate enough people everywhere.
To me, and this is my pitch, it means increasing global investments in education with a focus on the most vulnerable and those for whom education is difficult, if not impossible, to access. And that doesn't seem like the kind of thing a public health doctor might say, but education is the cornerstone of global health and offers the best hope for building back better in the wake of COVID-19.
I urge rich countries to persuade international financial institutions to provide more funds to low-income countries. The unavoidable truth is that no one is safe on this globe until every one of us is safe.
COVID became a magnifying glass of what we in MSF are daily confronted with: social violence, all those large-scale social forces, racism, gender inequality, poverty, political violence, and war, which very often determine who falls ill and who has access to care. So for us, indigenous populations, people on the move, homeless, prison detainees, elder people in nursing homes are the marginalized majority who should not be neglected or excluded.
We need to make some changes in our global governance system, but that means we also need research that's going to inform what those global governance changes should be. It shouldn't just be based on what we know of from the past. Indeed, the business as usual approaches haven't actually gotten us to where we need to get to. We need new ideas, we need science, we need research about these issues, about global governance, international law, politics, polarization, in order to figure out how do we make changes that will lead to a much better future.
We pretend that the rules that govern markets are always neutral and fair. But allowing markets to determine outcomes has shifted economic risk towards people and families and away from the institutions that could better bear them.
We need to focus on practical, adaptable, existing solutions that can be scaled and calibrated and complemented in targeted ways, and that will last.
If you can get businesses to go digital, that is where big ideas and opportunities lie. The internet allows a business anywhere in the world to connect with a consumer anywhere else in the world. Buy local and buy green initiatives have been successful. So why not create a policy framework to support women entrepreneurs via a Buy Female marketplace with initiatives to support, grow, and amplify female-led small businesses? That's my big idea.
We stand at the beginning of a new era, a time of digital and ecological transformation, megatrends that will have a massive impact on our societies. As citizens of liberal democracies, preserving our way of life will require new progressive concepts based on solidarity and cooperation rather than on populism and nationalistic reflexes.
We have this challenge with women. We have this challenge with young people, and somewhere in between, we need to come up with a really credible way of keeping them in the system. So childcare is one, work from home. Things like broadband should be an essential service so that people get it no matter where they live. You know, north of just Toronto, you can be 1 kilometer outside of a major city and you don't have the same access. So we need to actually have governments either step up or, you know, I'm a big believer in partnerships between government and business, and we've got to find the way to do that and to do it quickly.
I think there is a certain nostalgic pull that our political opponents will rely on to pretend that the best that we can hope for is some kind of return to how things were in the pre-COVID economy. And the reason why I have some confidence that we can build back better, as you said in your question, is because the alternative for the great mass of working people around the world is too horrible to contemplate.
We also understand that our best defense against the spread of the virus is in our communities with science, and we made historic investments in vaccine research, treatments, and testing, including sourcing the required materials so that Canada could lead the world in the search for life-saving solutions to COVID-19.
The reality for Black and ethnic minority people is always the same, which is because of the colour of their skin, their lives, their life chances, their life outcomes are always much more insecure, conditional, and precarious in Western societies.
Second, investing too much energy in promoting empathy can distract us from the difficult yet necessary task of actually listening to others. Why would I engage in an uncomfortable conversation with someone if I could just imagine how I would feel in their shoes? Rather than assuming that we have to resolve conflict in order to achieve inclusive societies, we are better off trying to encourage citizens to accept and become more comfortable with some level of disagreement.
And if we're not careful, 30 years of progress can be erased. Now, all of us on this call have always been frustrated about the lack of urgency. We've tried to work hard to get the equality agenda addressed quicker. Actually, for the first time in my lifetime, we're talking about going backwards. And it actually coincides with the culture war that Mayor Lightfoot will know more about than I do, but actually we're experiencing in the UK as well. But also the rise of nationalist populist movements around the globe. And that's why Minouche's given us the economic data, why it's so important. Diversity leads to greater productivity, which leads to greater profit. That should be the last card we use, because there's a moral case and a social case why it's so important. So what we've done today is make sure that when it comes to the things I'm responsible for, we look at the impact on women and girls, on all our policies.
In the United States, at least, while women have been invited into the workforce, we are being invited into structures that were created by and for the benefit of men. It still doesn't work. Women remain in the United States the primary caretakers of our children. That is a truism. And as we think about restructuring work environments, we've got to think about the realities of women's lives. And as we remain the primary caretakers of our children, we have to have structures and institutions that reflect that reality.
The evidence I've seen is that there isn't a genetic reason why Black and ethnic minorities are more vulnerable to COVID. It's because of deprivation in general. The fact that they don't have access to healthcare, or maybe doing jobs that are more risky, et cetera, et cetera. And so it really goes to the issue of how do you address those conditions, those fundamental economic and social conditions. That is what's at stake. I think what we need in the wake of this crisis is a new social contract that addresses those fundamental issues.
The Youth Environment Service, or YES, can do just this. Modelled on national service schemes, YES would give every young person the opportunity to do 1 year of environmental service, with the aim of making the world more resilient to climate change, floods, fires and pandemics, and making our environment and way of life more sustainable.
In fact, for many of us, very little will change as we make this transition. Instead of fossil fuel burning cars, we will have electric cars. Our homes will be heated with heat pumps, our appliances will be all electric. Our cars will be zippier, our air will be cleaner, and we will all be healthier. When we are hooked up to an omnidimensional grid, something we think of as similar to the internet, we will be able to share packets of electricity, much like today we share packets of information.
The worry that this is going to exacerbate differences within society. So it is only going to help to work if we leave no one behind, and that this is not just a slogan, but this is translated very concretely in social policies. If we don't succeed in doing that, then we can forget about reaching climate neutrality by 2050, because people will oppose it because they feel they lose out and they don't have a part in this. The point is that you need to give people sort of places where they can engage themselves, because I don't worry a lot anymore about climate deniers, even if there's one sitting in the White House. I worry more about climate desperation, people saying, well, it's all lost and I can't do anything about it, so let's live it out, or let's try and save ourselves. And if you can give people some issues, they can really act themselves and show, hey, this has an effect. You know, one of the most popular pieces of legislation we offered, I prepared in the last 5 years, was the single-use plastics legislation. And it had an immediate effect on plastics going into the oceans, etc. And people say, hey, that's what I'm doing. I'm doing this myself. So this is something we need to...
Before I go into that, I think it's really important what was just said, that we have to be with people. That people need to understand why it matters that we take action like climate change. We can't sound like environmentalists and shame people. We have to bring people together. It's about clean air, clean water, animals, biodiversity, although even that is an inaccessible word for most people. It's about saving money. It's about good jobs. It's about growth.
We now have a media system that doesn't allow us, most of the people, most of the time, to access the same set of facts. We have a digital media system that doesn't give us space for civil deliberation, where people who disagree with one another can come together and try to find common ground. And it pushes us away from an idea of common purpose or national unity. These are the problems that are evident when you look at what happened in information markets around the pandemic. They are a symptom of a broader underlying problem in the relationship between technology, media, and democracy. And it's one that we need to recognize and address.
We have to create
a completely new way of civic engagement, where we find new ways of reinvigorating democracy by bringing young people together in purposeful functions. We have many ideas for that, by creating new ways of participating. This is something that has been tested in various countries, some with absolutely fabulous success, where civic organization and civic debates and civic decision makings has been the precursor for bigger decisions in government, and thus changing our perception of democracy as something where we are consumers voting every 4th or 5th years to become engaged citizens. And that's why we are talking about creating a citizens' democracy.
You know, too often, you know, there's this big sort of illusion that young people do not care about the issues that affect them, or they do not care about politics. And, you know, for us, what we see here when we work with young people here in UK, in Europe, and even some of the work that we've done in the US, is that, of course, young people do care about issues. So you mentioned climate change, and, you know, partly the reason why, you know, the conversation has shifted on climate change over the last, you know, year or two is because you've had, you know, inspirational activists like Greta Thunberg and lots of young activists from across the world. Of course, young people do care about whether they have a decent job that pays them basic respect or dignity. Of course, they care about whether they have a roof over their shoulders. The problem is whether they see traditional forms of politics or democracy as a vehicle to address the issues that they care about.
Welcome back. So as you can see, we covered a lot of ground over the past 3 days. And to help tie that together and help us sort of build a sort of a themed response to some of the different bold and big ideas that we heard over the past 3 days, I had the great pleasure to be joined by an esteemed panel. Again, Kevin Page, the president and CEO of the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa, and one of the co-founders of the Recovery Project. Heather Boushey, who is the president, CEO, and founder of the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. Alan Yu, a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. And Matt Brown, the co-founder of Global Progress, a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, and one of the co-founders of the Recovery Project. Hello to you all.
Wow.
So let's dive in. One of the way in which we structured the Recovery Summit was on the axis of big ideas. We asked people to submit pre-recorded idea pitches to us. It formed the backbone of a lot of our panel conversations that we had. And so, Kevin, I'm gonna go to you first here. We've often said throughout the Recovery Project that we've asked the question of like, okay, what's possible now that wasn't possible before? And so I'm curious to you, when it comes to all these big ideas and these big pitches for big transformational change, why is now the time?
Alex, yeah, I think it's just great to be with you. Why is it possible now? I think it's, we find ourselves in a crisis that so many of the speakers over the past few days have talked about, that is quite complicated. All these challenges, whether they're climate change or inclusion, they are building a more resilient healthcare system in all around the world. These are very complicated challenges that will pull us together. Of course, we need leadership. And as Dr. Philpott said so nicely in that video, we need to kind of raise our eyes. And we need to look not just around, but we need to look farther ahead. And I think if we're capable of doing that, I think a lot becomes possible at this moment in time.
Matt, you and I have had lots of conversations both on Recovery Project podcasts and live streams, and also, in the formation of this project. What's your view on why this post-pandemic? Sorry, not post-pandemic. We're very much still in the middle of the pandemic, but what is it about this moment that we're in that enables the kind of big thinking that we've seen over the past few days?
Look, I mean, I think the first thing is that the public is incredibly aware that we're in the middle of spending huge amounts of money, whether that's through furlough schemes and support, whether that's through investment in public health infrastructure. the scale of the investment, the public investment that is taking place at this moment is unprecedented. And so when you're spending that amount of money that's coming from the public purse, it's incumbent upon us to think, well, what kind of world do the public want coming out of this? What are the values, the hopes, the aspirations, and I suppose as well as the fears that the public wants? So that's why I feel this moment will be different. I think the data that Tim Dixon showed us at the beginning, this More in Common survey that's actually being released publicly today, shows that on a number of fronts, people do want investment in jobs, they want investment in public health, they want to make the transition to a clean energy future, but they also want a degree of fairness. They feel that if we're investing to keep airlines afloat, if we're investing to keep other businesses viable during this transition process, during this furlough process, then we should expect more from business as we come out of that. We should expect a fairer economy, a fairer society, and a more sustainable way of doing business.
The reason why I like the panel that we have constructed right now is because we have people who were not only involved in the planning of the summit, but people who were watching. Alan, I know you were watching, and Heather, you were actually one of our pitchers of an idea. You actually submitted a very urgent plea in our shared prosperity and actually our institutions sessions around the urgent need to tackle income inequality. You and I were talking before the session started that, and you addressed in your idea pitch video that, that's a long-standing wicked problem. What is it about the landscape that you see right now? And maybe to Matt's point, it's the tremendous amount of money that's flowing from the public purse. What is it about this moment right now that makes income inequality a ripe target for solving?
Thanks, Alex. And this is what an incredible event. So I loved that video. So income inequality has been with us for a long time here in the United States. It's been growing for most of my life. It's the last 40 or 50 years or so, and not just across income, but across wealth. We're also seeing this rising concentration across firms. And what 2020 has really just brought into stark relief is the ways that these inequalities create fragilities across our economy and across our society. So when you just think about the United States, one of the things that as soon as you heard about the pandemic, knowing what the trends were and the statistics were around inequality, you knew that it was highly likely that the US would experience a deeper and more protracted fallout, both in the health and in the economic side, because of inequality, right? We are one of the only countries in the world that doesn't make sure that everybody has access to healthcare. One of the only countries that doesn't make sure everyone can stay home if they're sick. Well, these are the result. This is what inequality means on the shop floor in workplaces all across our country. And yet what it meant was that we were uniquely vulnerable. People were going into work sick. People were afraid to go to the doctor. They're still afraid to go to the doctor, so they don't know that they're sick. And that just, I think, illustrates that ignoring inequality means that we've allowed these fragilities to fester. And then at the other end, right, we saw what happened during the Great Recession. We bailed out those at the top. We did it because we had to. We had to bail out those banks in the moment, sort of the government was stuck between a rock and a hard place. What we saw was that those at the top saw their wealth come back very quickly. By 2012, the top, the most wealthy in the United States had regained all their wealth, and then they were just kept growing. But most Americans didn't experience a recovery in their wealth in the same way. And so I think people are really frustrated by that. So they want the economy to be strong. They understand that business plays a role. That those are the folks that hire them and create all the things. But it can't be this one-sided deal, and that one-sided deal ultimately makes us more fragile. So I think this moment is just it's really ripe for having this conversation in a new way, at least here in the United States.
Alan, I want to bring you in because to Heather's point of using this moment to have an old conversation a new way. Your research centers squarely in the sustainability and the climate change space. I can't think of anything more tailor-made to that framing. I know that you watched our sustainability session with great interest. I'm wondering, did anything jump out at you? Did anything stick out at you as particularly sort of salient from that session? And then maybe we can chat a little bit about how we form a narrative out of that.
Sure. Well, Alex, thanks again for inviting me to this discussion. One of the things that I thought about a lot as I was watching the session was this question about, this is an historic time globally, and some of these challenges are just so massive. And how is it that we figure out ways in which individuals can feel empowered to try to act and engage on this? And so that was why when I saw Martin Moore's big idea on the Youth Environment Service, which was very similar to an idea that Frans Timmermans talked about in Youth Conservation Corps, I thought that really resonated, because I think it's a brilliant way to channel that youth enthusiasm and frankly their impatience on the climate crisis and sustainability in general, but also to help foster kind of creative on the ground thinking and collaboration to deal with these climate solutions. And obviously it's a smart way to address these job opportunity challenges that we're all facing. It kind of struck a chord for me in particular because, earlier in my life, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in the United States, and it really had a profound life direction impact. And I think we should broaden that kind of opportunity to many more people. And now's the right time from a challenge perspective vis-a-vis the COVID recovery and climate change. So for me, what happened was I was a middle school teacher in the Central African Republic in a village of about 5,000 people. And, I came away from that feeling, as a volunteer, one of my proudest contributions, I thought, was in helping to shift some people's attitudes towards the value of girls' education and encouraging some families to keep their daughters in school rather than have them drop out and go to the fields. And so coming out of that, as a young person, I felt like, here, I made a contribution. It gave me the confidence that, individuals can make a difference and a deep sense of global connectedness and, also a healthy dose of pragmatism as well. And I think that that offering that kind of opportunity at this time, when there's so much kind of pent up youth concern and enthusiasm and frankly frustration over how the world is taking on sustainability issues, I think provides this great opportunity for us to tap that energy to address these critical issues. One, and then two, to set up a pipeline in the future so that, hopefully these, very enthusiastic contributors will we'll see a path to kind of continue this work, as a career or as a life focus.
Matt, so much of what Alan is talking about, that youthful energy, the vibrancy of the kind of youth-led millennial and Gen Z movements, we've seen so much of that before come crashing against our institutions and our democracies, and the ability for our institutions to then take and translate that energy into positive change and into programs or outcomes that reflect the kind of vibrancy that it started with is often a challenge. And so I know that with your work with the Berggruen Institute and the Renovating Democracy Project, I mean you're kind of gnawing at the core of that idea, which is how do we make our democracies and our institutions not only better equipped to deal with social change, but also are just sort of inherently more vibrant and are better reflective. So I'm wondering how you sort of come at the idea that so much of this recovery effort, both at the national and the global level, is going to come down to the strength and the vibrancy of our institutions and our democracies.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a crucial issue, Alex. First, I'd like to say, I agree 100% with Alan. I think that the Youth Environmental Service or the Youth Conservation Service, or however we would frame that, I think it's a moment to do this. I think it can play in a variety of different ways. It can play in terms of providing a bridge year between education and employment. We're likely to have a very suppressed employment market for young people in the near future. So I think it can play a role there, but I think it can also play a role in training up and giving a global perspective, as well as a more diverse perspective to a whole new generation. I think the key to that, though, like when I think about democracy now and the current crisis, the global pandemic, but also more broadly in the rise of populism and the things that we've been witnessing so far, the way I approach this is to say that the way we do democracy and the way we do politics has now become a first order issue, not a secondary issue. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is the information environment in which democracy and politics is currently conducted needs to be reformed and renewed to ensure that we have a coherent public square for the 21st century. We will not solve the problems of divided, polarized societies, economically unjust societies, climate change, or indeed global public health, if we have an information environment that is polluted by misinformation, disinformation, and attempts to polarize and fragment our society. So, it becomes of primary importance that those people who care about climate change, who care about economic injustice, who care about racial injustice, also care about the quality of information and the information environment within which democratic discussion is taking place. And then I think we also, but beyond dealing with the information environment, I think we also desperately need to look at the institutions of democracy and to find a way of making them more inclusive and more participatory. Emmanuel Macron, for example, recently experimented with the idea of a citizens' assembly to look at issues around climate and the energy transition, and has pledged to take the findings of that and turn it into law. That was an assembly that brought in people from across France to discuss and debate the issues. Here in the UK, we have had a similar kind of citizens' engagement around long-term adult care, which led to, it was in a parliamentary committee, but it led to unanimous support for the decisions that committee found. And so what we find with this is that, while policy experts and analysts may not like 100% the kind of policies that come out of this, they're better because people have been involved, there's innovations in them, and they're also sustainable in terms of the long-term trajectory of this. So what we need to do is to find a way in which the information system can be reformed, and a duty of care on social media platforms is key to this, as well as changing their business model and how they target. But we also need to find a way of increasing participation in democracy. I call it participation without populism. If we can find a way of integrating people into the decision-making process, then we're going to end up with a better, healthier policy-making process, and one that I think will deliver not just better results, but also a happier public.
Heather, I saw lots of nodding and sort of violent agreement with Matt there. How do you come at some of the threats that Matt raised there?
Well, one of the things that we've learned over the past decade from all of the political science research that's looked at the interplay between economic inequality and what that's done to our political systems and political outcomes is that these two things are very much connected. And a big piece of this is that for a long time, economists really downplayed the role of institutions in containing inequality, containing it at the top, or providing counterweights to concentrated economic power. And yet there's now all of this emerging evidence that exactly what Matt was just talking about is not only important for our democracy, but it's absolutely critical to put our economies on stronger, more stable footings moving forward. So you think about the race to the bottom in terms of lowering taxes at the top or allowing tax havens to exist that undermine all of our democracies and our abilities to raise revenue to do the things that we want to do. These are questions about the institutional capacity of the state to act. Or you think about, at least in the US case, this very sharp decline in union coverage. And so we're sort of, workers are left without an institution that can speak on their behalf in any structured way, and a real vacuum there as inequality has risen. And so those are just slightly different aspects of what Matt was talking about, but I really don't think you can stress enough that interplay and the role that concentrated economic power is playing in our political system and pushing outcomes towards allowing those at the top to rent seek, to bring home the bulk of the economic gains, rather than to see the kind of shared prosperity that's going to make our societies stronger over the long run.
Kevin, I'm going to give last word on this panel to you before we move on to our pollsters and strategists. Heather was talking, about money and politics, and I mean, your organization sits squarely at the nexus of our money and our finances and our democracy. So, I'm wondering if you can reflect on I think some of the ideas that you've heard, and help us and help our viewers translate for us how we would start to actually implement some of these bold ideas into a government system. I mean, political will is a huge ingredient, and we're going to talk about that with Frank and Marcus and sort of public opinion as well. But I mean, institutionally, there's no one better than you in Canada to speak to this. So if you can reflect a little bit on what you've heard.
Thank you, Alex. But first, I need to borrow your expression of violent agreement with my colleagues on the panel. And I would say, obviously in Canada, just to take this home a little bit, next week we get a speech from the throne. It will provide a vision for the parliament, over the next parliamentary session, which could be a short period of time, could be a long period of time. We have premiers of provinces, territories, First Nations people meeting in Quebec City. Like, what a great opportunity to kind of just to take on some of these ideas that we've heard over the past 3 days and bring them together in a much better environment. Alex, I really like what I see in Europe and to some degree, some parts of the United States, particularly with Mr. Biden's campaign. They've taken these big missions. Like in the case of the European Union, they've taken like climate change or oceans or cancer, food. Mr. Biden in his campaign is talking about, manufacturing, infrastructure, jobs, race, big issues that, we've talked about over the past 3 days. And I think, it would be so nice to see this reflected in our speech on the throne, in the discussions of premiers, and territorial leaders and First Nations people next week. They really bring people together, people that we've heard from even over the past 3 days. I think in terms of the big amounts of monies that Matt's talked about, they are large when you just, you look at it from a balance sheet perspective, but they reflect the fact that, we had to shut down an economy to deal with the public health crisis. The amount of money that we spent in Canada and other parts of the world, it's obviously trillions, it's hundreds of billions in Canada for supports. But again, this is just the first step. The second step has to be recovery to deal with all these issues that Alan, that Matt, and that Heather and others have talked about. And these have to be put in place. And because they're complex and because we need to work together on them, all the work that you've done over this week, Alex, we need to continue that forward. So I think hopefully we learn these lessons. Again, we heard all these messages that this is global. Like, if we're going to pick 5 challenges, all these challenges have to be global. One of them just has to be global, because we definitely have to go back to a multilateral approach to deal with, with health inequality and climate change. So again, I think for us, it starts next week. And, again, if we don't hear it as citizens, we got to put pressure on our political leaders to change, because I think there's some momentum thanks to you and, and this effort, but there's a lot of efforts around the globe really to change our way of thinking on these big issues.
That's a fantastic spot to end there. I want to thank Matt Brown, Heather Boucher, Kevin Page, and Alan Yu. Alan, thank you very much for drawing particular attention to the Youth Environment Service idea pitch. I think it has struck a chord with a lot of the organizers, and I know that there's going to be quite a groundswell, I think, to hopefully make that a reality. So thank you for bringing attention to that. To this panel, thank you very much. I am now going to bring in Frank Graves and Marcus Roberts. Frank is a celebrated and a fantastic pollster here in Canada. He's the president and CEO of Ecos Research. And Marcus Roberts is based in London. He's the director of international projects with YouGov. Gentlemen, do I have you both?
Yes, we're here. Great to see you.
Hi, good to see you. So I know that you were both listening into the conversation, the sort of the policy conversation that we just had. And one of the things that I was hoping to do over the next, I would say about 20 minutes, I know we started late on this, and I know there's some end times here that we've got to meet, so we'll get right to it. But, I have at my disposal here, a fantastic pollster and a fantastic strategist to take some of those policy ideas that we were just chatting about and translate them into public opinion and narrative building. So, Frank, I want to start with you. I know you've got a presentation here, and so maybe you can throw to that. You've come with some numbers, but maybe just as an opening question to you, we were just talking about political will, and sort of as an ingredient, a necessary ingredient to get a lot of this stuff, these big ideas that we've been talking about, done. Talk to me about public sentiment. Talk to me about where the public is right now at this crucial moment.
Well, we've been studying that in some depth since the crisis emerged, and let's be clear, this is an unprecedented collision of economic and health risk, possibly democratic risk, which is a once in a lifetime type occurrence. I have never seen such a rapid transformation of human attitude, behavior in such a short period of time in a very long career. These movements also connect backwards to some of the historical shifts that were going on and were referred to in the previous session, notably the collapse of the middle class bargain and shared prosperity, which I think set a lot of forces in motion, which have produced what I think is the other major force, which is connected with the pandemic and which really alters and needs to be understood because it changes the prospects for achieving some of the big project ideas and transformative ideas that have been discussed in the previous session. So I'd really like to kind of help understand just how vivid and profound these movements have been and what the challenges and opportunities which exist, because it is clear that the public are telling us, not just in Canada, but in other countries, that we're on the cusp of a great transformation, and the crisis, as painful and as cruel as it has been, may provide an opportunity to produce some accelerants that allow us to achieve a better world than what we saw at the beginning of this. And that idea of some light at the end of the tunnel is something which I think is really important, but it's going to require an enormous amount of skill, and it will have to understand just where the points of resonance and contradiction are with the public currently. So if I had the chance, I'd love to kind of just share a few thoughts.
Please. Thank you very much for bringing them.
Okay, if I could have the opening slide here. I'm not sure if that's queued up, but what I wanted to do is to begin with actually talking about the theme of the collapse of shared prosperity. And this has been reviewed by many experts, but what I've looked at it from the perspective of public opinion, and I've been tracking for some time in both Canada and the United States, the incidence of people who locate themselves, for example, as members of the middle class. At the beginning of this century, it was a case, and this had been the case for the previous 20 or 30 years in the 20th century, that a clear majority of both Americans and Canadians said, I'm a member of the middle class, which was both aspirational and income-based. But what we've seen as this century has unfolded, that number, which were in the high 60s, has dropped precipitously down to under 50%, which means that tens of millions of people have fallen out of the middle class and no longer feel that there's an optimistic future. So I want to start with that kind of framing and note that even though that daunting challenge of restarting middle class progress and shared prosperity is an incredibly profound challenge, it's actually morphed into something even perhaps more challenging, which is the rise of what some call authoritarian, or what we prefer to call
ordered populism. And what we've seen as a response over the last few decades, because this percolated slowly in the advanced Western world, is forces like the hyper-concentration of wealth, a sense of economic despair, a magnified sense of external risk, coupled with a cultural backlash where a lot of the people who were feeling this sense of loss of security also said the values that I believed in, traditional family values, whatever those traditional values, were also in collapse. And that produced this authoritarian reflex, which has produced, I think, a fairly unhealthy response, and one that is poorly understood by progressives. So that challenge now becomes superimposed on this once in a lifetime challenge of the pandemic. And initially it looked like some of those irreconcilable fault lines were actually diminished, and that people were more focused on the common challenge. But as the crisis has evolved, we see those fault lines re-expressing themselves quite vividly. And I'd like to point out that this is not like the traditional left-right contest or axis. It's one that is more properly understood as ordered or open. It has a very different sort of set of questions which permeate it. And so we find now that a lot of the shift from compliance to defiance, anti-masking, vaccine, anti-vax sentiment, and so forth, is also reestablishing a lot of these clear fault lines. What is even more important, though, and I wanted to share the fact that whatever the views are amongst elites and the institutional establishment, the public are overwhelmingly of the view that we are not going back to the status quo, that whatever this pandemic has produced, it's going to produce a different order, a very different balancing of society and economy. And that is seen as largely welcomed by most of the public. But I want to conclude by noting that it does appear that the contest for the future is very much now lining up to a contest between this ordered versus an open view of the future. And they both have winds in their sails. So, for example, on the ordered side, there's a desire to turn back the clock, pull up the drawbridge, make my country great again. So we see economic nationalism once again reestablishing itself, a desire for thicker borders, a real decline in enthusiasm for globalization, even trade liberalization. And all of those things line up very closely, a greater emphasis on security, and hostility to outgroups, xenophobia. All of those things are actually put some wind in the sails of the ordered or authoritarian side. But on the other hand, an even larger portion of the public seem to be going, no, this is a time to rebalance our society and economy in ways that put greater emphasis on not just GDP, but quality of life. We should be dealing with some of the social class fault lines that were laid bare so cruelly by the pandemic. We need to deal with climate change, a sustainable environment. Quality of life needs to be given more prominence along with our standard of living. So this sets the stage for a very fierce debate about what actually will be the post-pandemic world. And I think one of the real challenges for progressives and center moderates is that they fail to understand the power and force behind the authoritarian or ordered populist outlook. And if we don't understand that, we're really in danger of losing this challenge of contest for the future. But I would like to return just as a final comment that it seems that the solutions don't lie in sneering or denial, but understanding the forces that initially put this new force in motion, and that was a collapse of shared prosperity. So if we really can't figure out a way to provide an economic narrative of hope, then I don't think we're likely to put that genie back in the bottle.
Frank, thank you so much for bringing that numbers and those perspectives with you here. Marcus, I'm going to bring you in here. As you look at Frank's presentation, and also think about some of the work that you yourself have done at YouGov, what jumps out at you? And one of the things that Frank said towards the end there is, the challenge that progressives and center progressive movements have. I'm curious about this question of narrative building and taking that reality that Frank has sort of laid out and building a better political narrative out of it. So where do you come at?
Thanks, Alex, and thanks to the Recovery Summit for this invitation and for this opportunity. Particular thanks to Frank for organizing that data so clearly and so powerfully to frame the argument. I think that there's three different things here that will help us work out what a winning politics for the big ideas that the Recovery Summit has covered are. And those elements are the need for different politicians, the need to pursue different voters, and finally, the need for a different politics to put this together. So let's start with the need for different politicians. We need politicians of the left or the liberal left who like voters and who look like voters. As long as we continue to have politicians running for office who voters are suspicious of, because those politicians fundamentally themselves would rather spend their time at events, if I may say, such as this one, rather than spending a great deal of time with the voters themselves, we're going to have a problem. That means that it is not to say that there isn't a role for the higher education, higher income voter to become a politician themselves. But I do think we could all agree that all of our politics would be better if more of our politicians were diverse. Diverse in terms of their age, diverse in terms of their gender, diverse in terms of their ethnicity, and yes, even diverse in terms of their class. And we need to reform our political parties to ensure that we have that greater diversity across all ranges in terms not just of our frontline politicians, but of the people behind the scenes, either running campaigns or promoting the policy agendas in governments that we aspire to run. So that's the first thing. The second thing that we need to do differently if we're going to implement this progressive agenda as outlined by the Recovery Summit is think about the different voters we need to pursue. Because the risk of using the cliche once again, politics is about addition, not subtraction. And there's a strong temptation that Frank, I'm sure, is very aware of as his data shows, for the left or for the liberal left right now to think about the litmus tests that we can apply in politics, to think about all the ways in which we can't work with someone because we disagree with them in one area or another, or they fall short of some moral standard that we have established for what is and is not the one true pure path. This is very dangerous for the left to do because it stops us from building a majoritarian politics across different coalitions. Let's take the example of what some of the great environmental work done in Poland over the last 5 years has been. There, working particularly with the Catholic Church, environmental charities have reached out beyond the traditional liberal left coalition in order to use, amongst others, direct quotes from the Bible, as well as the teachings of Pope John Paul II, in order to talk about the importance of preservation and conservation. They've applied it very directly around the politics of clean air in Poland. In all of these areas, the liberal left has made unlikely allies with people who would not normally make common cause with us around social issues, but have found common cause around environmental ones. And that's really important for us. Now, the final part is, how does all of this come together in terms of a different politics? And here I think that the work that Tim Dixon and More in Common launched today internationally is crucial. And what Heather Bushey and Matt Brown were just saying a few minutes ago about the two sides of the coin, about economics and democracy and the lack of trust at the heart of voters and their feelings towards politics itself, towards the political economy that politics produces is so important to understand. Quite simply, we need to build a different and new political economy in order to address these problems. And that means a political economy based around earning and belonging. A political economy that does not say to people who don't live in cities, but rather live in towns, that that's it for your hopes of prosperity, but instead has a recovery project for our towns and small communities as well. A politics that says we appreciate that it's not just welfare that's going to see your income rise, it's going to be wages as well. I think some of the most interesting and exciting ideas over the last couple of days have been around how we develop a politics of prosperity that is genuinely shared, not just in terms of wealth, but in terms of sharing political power. And again, I'd point you to some of the work that that Heather Bruschi and her team have done in this area. So if we want to have the kind of radical politics that allows for youth environmental services argued for by Martin Moore to be delivered, if we want to have a bigger politics that fulfills Jane Philpott's challenge to raise our eyes around politics of geography and humility and addressing and tackling the underlying problems that we face, if we want to address some of the big challenges that Ben Scott was warning us about around digital divides and the very veracity of our news and information, then in all of these instances, I think we're going to need different politicians pursuing different voters with a different politics in a new way.
Frank, thank you, Marcus. I mean, the reason I'm struggling here is because I think I could just very well wrap the summit up right there. I think you've done a fantastic job of putting a cap on it. But before I let you both go, you've both touched on something that was raised at the very opening session of the Recovery Summit. Matt Brown moderated it. It was a really great conversation, and something that Jerry Butts, as a vice chair at Eurasia Group, former principal secretary to the Prime Minister of Canada, talked about the idea of, in this moment, meeting people where they are, acknowledging their anxieties, acknowledging their frustrations and their fears about the future, and not forcing a sort of a pre-cooked agenda onto an anxious public. Marcus, so much of what you just touched on is the idea of, in many cases, actually meeting literally people physically where they are, like going to new places and finding new people. Frank, how do you come at that as you reflect not only over the past few days, but what Marcus had to say and some of your own data?
Well, I think Marcus has provided, frankly, a brilliant synthesis of the challenges and a strategy for moving forward. If I could just add a couple of points, we need to look for the areas, elusive areas of common ground in a fragmented world, which has two incommensurably divided parts of society eyeing each other warily from cliffs which don't have any sort of bridge across them. And I think there are some examples of those that have emerged recently. I pointed the example, of the exposure of the fragility and risks of global supply chains. This produces a resurgent desire to reestablish manufacturing capacities in many places in the advanced Western world where they have atrophied. I believe, and that particular concept enjoys near Catholic support across both sides of this divide. And another area, I believe, is the idea that we need to redress the burgeoning hyper concentration of wealth at the top. Although the narrative for addressing that will be different depending on which side of the divide we look at, there is a considerable amount of common ground to do something dramatic to try and eliminate some of these huge fault lines which have been laid bare by the pandemic. I'd just like to make a final comment that we do need to understand more accurately and more empathetically the forces which have produced the division, and recognize that that the moral lecture or the dismissal of this as irrational and dumb is not very effective. It simply adds fuel to the fire. So we have to understand that that something which is driven more by moral certainty than reason and evidence actually has a place, and that we have to figure out how to communicate both in terms of strategic communications, but also in terms of policy in a way that it recovers some common ground. So that would be my comments.
Marcus, I'm going to give final word to you before we hand things back over to Matt Brown.
Yeah, we see extraordinary numbers right now for concern about the environment, for concern about diversity and inclusion issues. We see 86% of Americans, registered voters, per the latest YouGov polling with The Economist just this week, saying that civil liberties and civil rights and liberty itself are one of the most important issues in this election. We see 70% of registered voters saying that climate change is an important issue. These numbers are racing up the agenda, and that creates the political space for the left and liberal left to do something about this. But what is the question? And if the answer is to do the same politics that we did last time or the time before, to simply think that increasing public spending is now possible and now is going to solve the problem because we're able to tax more, will result in the fairer society that we all demand. Our thinking is necessary but not sufficient to the moment. Instead, we really need to tackle those gross inequalities, not just of wealth, but of power itself. And if you want to get at some of the kind of politics that Frank is saying command supermajority support across our electorates, then think about the politics that gives back control to citizens themselves. Think about how it is that you can empower workers, how it is that you can empower citizens, how you can make them feel that their democracy works for them, and how you can make them feel that their work has worthwhile value for them again. Our colleagues in the Australian Labour Party have been very successful at late in just the Eden Monaro by-election, for example, in framing it around good, well-paid, full-time jobs. And it was really interesting when they used that message because they were including full-time, attacking some of the problems of the gig economy and some of the problems of multiple part-time jobs required to make ends meet. If we do a politics that doesn't just address some of the problems from the top down, but actually thinks about power from the bottom up, then I think we'll see supermajority support, not just for our politics in polls, but majority support for our politicians at the polls. Thanks very much.
Marcus Roberts, Director of International Projects at YouGov, thank you very much. Frank Graves, President and CEO of ECOS Research Associates here in Ottawa, thank you very much for helping us wrap some of this up and understand some of the urgent and important next steps. I really appreciate you both joining. Matt Brown, I believe we have you on the line.
I am here, Alex.
Well, Matt, I can think of no better person to bring us to a close and land this plane than yourself. So I will hand things over to you in London for final word on the summit.
Okay, thanks, Alex. And I appreciate all you guys have done. And after I'll do a proper thanks in a minute. I wanted to say one last word on the points that Marcus raised. The late, great Philip Gould was very fond of saying politics starts where people are, not where we wish they would be. But I kind of feel that said, the evidence that we're seeing right now is the public seems to be moving to a space where we as progressives might hope they would be. And I think that the challenge for our politics going forward is to figure out how we work with them in a respectful and inclusive way rather than work for them, which is the way our old politics worked. So all of those issues around empowering those people themselves to be change makers and giving power back to communities, I think will be the key to that. So that's the last thing that I will say on substance, except maybe to say the process has now become part of the substance. But it's just incumbent on me, first of all, Alex, to say thanks to you and to the team at 2020 for all of the work that you have done. Mira, Mark, Karen and Luke behind the scenes, but also you guiding them and in front of camera. I'd like to thank our co-chairs, Dr. James Orbinski, Anne McClellan, Sadiq Khan, Franz Timmermans and Helle Thorning-Schmidt for the time that they have dedicated to this, both in participating in the discussions, but also in helping shape the agenda that we've had over the last 4 days. We set out at the beginning of this week to really start a conversation that will help shape both the policy agendas and the political strategies needed to guide a progressive recovery to this pandemic. This is a crisis, this pandemic, that has exposed and exacerbated the inequalities and injustices in our societies. And as we look to remedy them and resolve them and move forward, the conversation we have begun must continue and intensify in the months ahead. I know that we all hope that some of the ideas that we presented and put forward this week will continue to be debated by leaders and policymakers at the UN General Assembly at the end of this week and going into next week. But I think the interesting thing is, for the first time for global progress and for the 2020, we've sort of opened up this discussion beyond policymakers and strategists and political leaders to a broader audience of interested citizens. So my final thanks, and most sincere thanks, I suppose, is to those of you, those people who wouldn't normally join, who've bothered to tune in and watch and join us here over these last 4 days. This is the first time that we've hosted an online summit. And And it's the first time that we've sought to include a broader audience. I'm personally proud of what the team has achieved, but as with all first attempts, I'm sure we've made a lot of mistakes, and there are many, many things that we could improve upon. So when you guys have time to reflect on what you've watched, heard, and listened to over the last 4 days, please do share your thoughts with us on what we did right and also on what we got wrong. The ideas that inspired you and those that we missed and should have included. Share those with us. We'd love to hear from you. But most of all, what we'd like to hear from you is how you would like to be included and engaged in this conversation going forward. So please, take that time and speak to us. This pandemic impacts each and every one of us in unique ways. And that means that each and every one of us has a role to play and a say in shaping what the recovery should look like. So I'd just like to say once again, thanks for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've been inspired as I have. And before we close, I'd just like to say, before we meet again and before we carry on this conversation, please stay safe and stay healthy. Thank you. Goodbye.